Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Rebecca Cordell in the School of Economic, Political and Policy Sciences at UT Dallas. Today I'm going to be talking to you about Afghanistan and the human rights context. First, a bit about me and my research. I broadly study the question, what determines whether a government engages in human rights violations and to what extent? My research looks at human rights all around the world over time using quantitative data. I look at state repression, that is repressive responses from the state to dissent, as well as political violence, and I develop ways of measuring human rights, which is a very difficult phenomenon to measure given that many governments are trying to hide it. Here's just an example of some research I've done with my colleagues Chris Farris, Chad Clay, Reed Wood and Thorin Wright. This image here shows data that we've collected and built on all types of physical integrity rights violations from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and State Department reports for all countries, building a data set of allegations, extracting that text so that we can build a map just like this, which shows those countries that have greater number of physical integrity rights allegations contained in those human rights reports, the darker countries with more allegations, the lighter countries with less allegations, from 1999 to 2016. So what is the human rights context like in Afghanistan given recent events? We're going to start by looking at human rights data to explain this. So the political terror scale is a popular measure of human rights that provides levels of physical integrity rights violations. Specifically, how do countries engage in extrajudicial killings, torture, disappearances, and arbitrary arrests and political imprisonment? So this is what the situation has looked like in Afghanistan since 1976 to date, with the most recent data up until 2019. We have two different measures here. The blue line is from the US State Department reports, which give information on Afghanistan as well as other countries' human rights violations. And the red line comes from Amnesty International reports that similarly is giving broad overview of countries' human rights practices. So what we see here is that the scale on the vertical axis goes from 1 to 5. That's because the political terror scale give 1 a good rating of human rights, where human rights are rare, physical integrity rights allegations are rare, right up until 5, where political terror and physical integrity rights abuses have expanded to the whole population. So what we're seeing here is that Afghanistan, over this time period since the data set began, really has remained at high levels of physical integrity rights abuses at level 4 and level 5, switching between throughout this period. Human rights violations compared to other countries around the world, over this time period, things are pretty bad. So what does the future of human rights look like in Afghanistan? Will they improve? Will they decline, or will they stay the same? We can begin to answer this question, provide some potential suggestions by looking at the human rights behaviour of the Taliban in the past. This is important because improvements to human rights abuses take time. We shouldn't expect actors to change the way that they've been doing human rights violations just like that. So let's look at what human rights violations were like under the Taliban rule of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. Human rights violations were widespread during this time, with systematic violations targeting women and girls. There were also cruel forms of corporal punishment, including executions taking place. Many restrictions on religion, expression, and education. We can also look more recently at how has the Taliban behaved on human rights in those controlled areas as the Taliban gradually took control of Afghanistan. So from 2019 to 2020, Human Rights Watch did many interviews within 3 provinces that the Taliban controlled. What they found was recently Human rights violations weren't as bad as they were from 1996 to 2001, but there were still violations of women's rights, particularly with reference to women and girls' education. There's also been evidence of arbitrary detention and political imprisonment in these areas controlled by the Taliban, and summary punishment, including executions. It's also important to consider what are some human rights trends in post-conflict settings in order for us to try and understand what potentially the future looks like for human rights in Afghanistan. A 20-year civil conflict has taken place, and now the Taliban is in control. How conflicts end can shape human rights protections, and previous research on human rights has found that when we have rebel victories, human rights can tend to be particularly bad, particularly when it comes to social rights and women's rights. This is because when rebel groups win civil wars, they're less likely to engage in institutional reform if they have simply taken control, rather than engaging in a peace process where certain commitments to institutional reforms have been agreed to, and perhaps women, as well as other marginalised groups, would have been involved in that process too, holding them to account. Rebel victories have also been found by the literature to more likely marginalise human rights allies domestically as well as internationally, those outside groups and countries that can really hold the Taliban in this case to account when violating human rights. If we look at the human rights violations that have taken place just since the Taliban took over Afghanistan and regained control of Kabul just last month, we already start to see some types of human rights violations. Summary executions of civilians, restrictions on women's rights slowly taking over in terms of education and other areas of workplace and participation in society, and repression of peaceful dissent and other expressions of protest. So what are the human rights concerns from human rights activists as well as academics? So one finding from human rights research is that democratic principles and institutions matter. However, something that has made clear in the Afghanistan case is that an external actor state building to try and create a democracy is not as straightforward as it seems and can lead to problems, as we've seen. However, research shows that democracies with institutions and principles of respecting the rule of law and civil liberties more likely to see human rights improve, which is why many have called for that to continue in Afghanistan. However, the question is, how likely is that given the Taliban's history, ideology, and future of what's to come? There are key fears from activists on the ground for reprisal killings and punishment, people that were allies of US forces, as well as international organisations, human rights defenders, and justice. There's also a real concern about abuse of women's rights. Many women already protesting about education, not having dress restricted. And we're also seeing threats and concerns to journalists as well as civil society leaders and lawyers. Governments, particularly new governments, are keen to repress those agents that threaten exposing them in human rights abuses. There's also concern that minorities of ethnic and religious groups are under threat too, given the diversity of groups that live within Afghanistan. And of course, we can't ignore the massive humanitarian crisis that has been created from internally displaced people within Afghanistan, as well as the millions of refugees and asylum seekers that have fled since the Taliban have been gaining control in Afghanistan. So how can you help? Amnesty International have created this United for Afghanistan campaign where they are suggesting go to our website, watch and share some of this information, especially on Twitter. They have this toolkit on the right-hand side where you can organise events in solidarity with Afghanistan and human rights defenders in Afghanistan. You can read more on the issue through their website and through some of those key links on that right-hand side toolkit. Sign petitions, particularly urging the safe passage of Afghans seeking refuge in other countries and to protect Afghan human rights defenders within the country. Another way is to, of course, connect with some of the organisations that are participating in this event. Get involved with them, find out how you can help. That's the link for this human rights toolkit. So that concludes my short, brief, what does the future look like if human rights in Afghanistan? What does research on human rights tell us? And what are some of the key concerns of protecting human rights in Afghanistan in the future? Thank you.